It's always been considered sort of the holy grail of cardiology to get a non-invasive assessment of hemodynamics that is accurate and available and actionable and repeatable. Heart failure patients represent the highest readmission group over the age of 65. 25% of heart failure patients will be readmitted within 30 days. The annual costs of heart failure currently are over 110 billion per year, and the vast majority of those costs are avoidable, right?
Welcome back to another episode of the GS MedTech Podcast, where I speak with industry leaders shaping the future of MedTech. I'm Dame Medarski, and my guest today is Filip Peters, founder and CEO of Acori Medical, a Swedish MedTech company developing a non-invasive hemodynamic monitoring platform designed to estimate cardiac and pulmonary pressures without the need for catheterization. Filip, great to have you with us today.
Thanks for having us, Dame.
So knowing your background and understanding, you don't originally come from a clinical background. What drew you into cardiology and heart failure care to begin with?
So you're right about that. My background's in machine learning, and I did that in finance for many years. So looking at identifying patterns in time series data and using that to predict something, right? And I think that's surprisingly similar use case in cardiology and within MedTech. We're looking at sensor data, so also time series data, trying to find patterns in that data to then estimate or predict something, which in this case, to your point, are the cardiac and pulmonary pressures for heart failure management. So like most good things in life, it was a random thing. I had the random opportunity to join another startup within the MedTech space, and I tried it. Like many startups, it didn't quite go as planned for them. The patents didn't come through, and the technology wasn't as mature as they'd hoped. So that shut down, and then I had sort of the idea of starting Acorai, and this was about 6.5 years ago. So no grand master plan here, Dam. It just sort of happenstance.
Yeah, such are the most amazing entrepreneurial stories as well. And I'm always curious because obviously as a founder and entrepreneur, you always believe in what you're building. But at what point did you realize actually what we're building is not just an incremental improvement, but potentially it's a category defining product?
Pretty early on, I would say, right? Or at least the problem that we were solving was one that cardiologists around the world had been wanting solved for many decades, right? It's always been considered sort of the holy grail of cardiology to get a non-invasive assessment of hemodynamics that is accurate and available and actionable and repeatable, etc. Right? So we knew that pretty early on. I think we realized slowly but surely that it was a slightly more complex engineering problem than we had originally thought.
As usually is the case.
We're on our third redesign now in 6.5 years, and we're finally in a place where we're super happy about the quality of the device and the data that we're getting. But it's taken some time to get there. So yeah, it was quite obvious early on. I would say the reason it hadn't been solved, right, is really for three reasons. One is that we've never had sensors that are as high quality and as sophisticated as they are now in this particular size factor. So the size of sensors have come down and the power has gone up. The cost of these sensors, have also gone down dramatically over the past 10 years. And then lastly, the computational power and AI know-how has gone up dramatically. It's kind of the intersection of those three things that's made it possible now as opposed to 10 or 20 or 30 years ago.
Amazing. And for those outside of cardiology and not understanding the space, why is measuring cardiac filling pressure so central to managing heart failure?
Yeah, so these pressures, which are effectively the blood pressures inside the heart, and as I'm sure many of your listeners know, the heart has many different compartments. So you have different pressures and different sides of the heart, which are very important vital signs when it comes to understanding heart failure and are the most sensitive vital signs when it comes to identifying whether a patient is stable or not, and whether the patient's condition is improving or deteriorating. So without these pressures, it is very difficult to make an accurate assessment of the patient's condition, particularly for heart failure patients. It has application areas, across many different patient groups and many different clinical workflow settings. But heart failure patients, we would say, are the ones that tend to benefit the most from being managed with the cardiac and pulmonary pressures.
And nowadays, how often are treatment decisions made without direct hemodynamic data?
Yeah, so standard care really varies a lot depending on where you are and what clinical setting and what type of hospital. You know, in the best of cases, you will have a heart failure specialist who will typically use a number of different non-invasive tools to assess these patients. That could include drawing blood and assessing the patient with blood-based biomarkers such as NT-proBNP or BNP. You will do an echocardiography, so looking at the IVC, or you can look at lung ultrasound to assess whether there's fluid in the lungs. You can do an X-ray to also look at fluid in the lungs, and many cases you will listen with your stethoscope, or you will assess the physical symptoms of these patients. And despite all of these things, that there are some obvious issues with them in that they're not always available. They're typically lagging in lagging real physiology. So you're always a little bit behind what's actually going on with the patient. They are not always repeatable. Right? There is a bit of an art form associated with these assessments, which means that two healthcare professionals might not always agree on what the true hemodynamics of the patient is. And it's that variability and lack of availability and frankly, lack of accuracy in many cases as well that leads to subpar decisions being made for these patients.
And what are the real world consequences from those decisions in terms of admissions, readmissions, cost of care?
Yeah, pretty severe. Right? Heart failure patients represent the highest readmission group over the age of 65. So about 25% of heart failure patients will be readmitted within 30 days. And the reason for that is manifold, right? These are difficult patients to manage. They have often many comorbidities. So it's not just heart failure, but you will often have COPD. You will often have other cardiovascular diseases that are making an assessment and management of these patients very difficult. One of the big unmet needs that we have identified is ensuring that we are optimizing therapy for these patients when they're in the hospital and optimizing decisions in this patient workflow when they're in the hospital. Yeah. So today, about 50% of patients get discharged when they have residual congestion. So they still have elevated pressures. And these patients often look fine. They often feel fine. Or they just really want to go home, and then they're telling someone that they feel fine. But again, in 50% of cases, they're not fine, right? And they get discharged with what's called residual congestion, which we know is one of the major drivers of readmission rates and mortality rates in heart failure patients. So part of the value of our tool is ensuring that we are fully decongesting these patients or getting them down to a normal pressure level, and that we're trying to optimize guideline-directed medical therapy as much as possible during that hospitalization stay, which we know again is this window that often gets wasted, not GDMT optimizing, and that's hugely important for driving better outcomes in these patient groups.
Thank you for that. And maybe at a high level, you can tell us, how does your non-invasive system estimate intracardiac pressure?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've built what's called a SAVE sensor system. And just to go back a little bit, the name Acorai comes from a combination of three words. So acoustic, core, and AI, which represent what we do, right? We're listening to the heart with AI.
Yeah.
And we're listening with 4 different types of sensors, something we call the SAVE sensor system. And SAVE is another acronym for the 4 different types of technologies that we use. So seismic, acoustic, visual, and electric sensors. We've borrowed heavily from other industries to kind of come up with this combination of sensors and the exact location of these sensors and how they interact with the exterior of the body, and to collect signals with as high fidelity as possible. Mm-hmm. And you've been doing similar things in many other industries, right? So the oil and gas industry has been using seismic and acoustic sensors for many, many decades. Engine diagnostics, elevator diagnostics, basically any system where you're trying to detect weak signal in noisy systems. There has been some very interesting research in the past. So we've applied a lot of those concepts into our device. Mm-hmm. But the way the device works, you simply place it on the patient's chest. It has a multimodal sensor platform. The seismic sensors detect very small chest wall vibrations on the surface of the skin. The acoustic sensors are effectively, you can think of them as our own highly optimized electronic stethoscopes. which focus on a slightly different frequency range than your typical heart sounds. We have visual sensors, so PPG sensors that look at the capillaries of the chest region. And then we have ECG, sort of a workhorse of cardiology, right, which is more there to time the cardiac cycle to make sure that these sensors are aligned. We then fuse these time series sensor data sets, and we identify patterns in that data set using machine learning. And at this point, we've built a global data set of over 2,000 patients that have all undergone a right heart catheterization procedure, which is the gold standard for measuring these pressures invasively, right? So a very high quality data set, very large data set, and diverse across 6 countries, which is what's allowed us to build a device that collects data with a high degree of fidelity and quality, but also allows us to estimate these pressures non-invasively.
And what level of clinical validation is required for physicians to trust a non-invasive alternative to obviously the gold standard?
Yeah, I mean that's a complex question, right? I think it depends who you are and what type of physician you are. I think the closer you are to heart failure, the more you realize the complexity of managing these patients. And I think the more you welcome the advance of novel tools such as ours as another tool that you have in your toolbox to assess these patients, right? But I think accuracy is, of course, number one. And we completed our CaptureHF study last year, which was a 1,600 patient study across 20 hospitals in 6 countries, which allowed us to show that we are accurate versus the gold standard. And we have levels of accuracy that are similar to and most likely better than your average non-invasive assessment by a heart failure specialist, right? So I think in terms of accuracy, we've been able to show that we're there. The true value of our device, I would say, is the availability, repeatability of the device, and just the lack of variability and how to interpret the device, right? You can send you and I could go in, Damian, and do the same measurement and we would get the same result, right? That's not often the case in this workflow. So that's also part of the value that we're bringing to the show. The second thing I would say is answering the so what question. And the so what question, in this case is, all right, you're accurate, but do you have clinical utility? And we're just today actually kicking off our HOSP-HF study, which is an observational study looking at the hospitalized heart failure patient workflow. Where we're going to integrate into what we're targeting as our beachhead market, which is the hospitalized heart failure patient market. And the goal there is to do daily measurements with the Acorai device from the day of admission to the day of discharge to show that patients that had better decongestion or better therapy optimization as measured by our device, they also had better 30-day outcomes post-discharge. There could be lower readmission rates, lower mortality rates, lower all-cause adverse event rates, right? And that's the first step in the sort of health economic evidence generation strategy to show that, all right, this has potential value for patients in improving outcomes, but this also has important economic benefits for the hospital in terms of reducing readmissions, reducing cost of care, and helping these U.S. hospitals predominantly stay more profitable.
Amazing. You've mentioned the CaptureHF study, and I know from reading some materials that you've published online, the data showed strong sensitivity, but also high negative predictive value as well. Why is the rule-out performance clinically powerful?
Yeah, so the simple reason for that is that a false negative in a heart failure patient is typically a lot more dangerous than a false positive, right? And if you think about it conceptually, if a patient shows up in the hospital, if they're in the hospital and you tell them that they're fine, but they're not fine, they might go home and then a few days later, they will likely come back with another acute decompensation. For heart failure, another readmission is not just a nice visit to the hospital, right? It's a pretty gruesome event. And many studies have shown that these readmissions cause a permanent deterioration in cardiac function for every acute episode. So the readmission reduction story is very much a let's improve patient care story, not just a reducing readmission reduction story. So that's very important. False positives are not what anyone wants, right? But I think a false positive in this case would simply mean that a patient would continue down the diagnostic care pathway that they usually do, right? We are a device that will be used alongside standard of care tools to inform clinical management. So you will never solely rely on the Acorai device for any decisions. All right. We're very clear about that. So I think weighing those two against each other, a false negative is clearly the dangerous one. And having a high negative predicted value is very important in this case.
And does adoption of your device require any workflow change, or does it integrate naturally into the existing cardiology pathways?
Yeah, so I think this is the beauty of what we're solving, right? I think whenever we talk to a heart failure nurse or hospitalist or internal medicine doc or cardiologist for that matter, they immediately understand the problem that we're solving, right? Congestion is such a difficult thing to assess, and the variability of the workflow is such that it often results in these inadequate decisions being made. So we're just latching on to existing standard of care and to the existing workflow. We are aiming to operationalize and protocolize this workflow a little bit more through the health economic studies that we're running to show hospitals that this is how you could potentially integrate the Acorai device, because we think that will be a very important part of driving adoption for this device.
And is this primarily an in-hospital diagnostic tool, or do you see broader outpatient applications?
Yeah, I mean, wherever there's a heart failure patient, there's value to be had with the Acorai device. We got to pick our battles. So I think the largest unmet need that we see is in the hospitalized heart failure patient setting, so inpatient. The goal there is to help triage patients and get them to the right care faster, and with higher degree of accuracy. Once they have been admitted, the goal is to reduce overall cost of care. That could mean fewer unnecessary procedures, a reduction in length of stay, but then, crucially, making sure we're discharging patients that are fully decongested and have a lower likelihood of being readmitted, right? I think that's the big low-hanging fruit for us, is really to help optimize that part of the workflow. And then, you have outpatient follow-up, right, which will come after that, where potentially the patient takes our device home, and the outpatient clinics have our device to make sure that the patient's still stable in the outpatient setting as well.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but you're positioning your device against implantable monitoring systems more as a complementary rather than a competitive device.
Correct. So we think that the implantable sensors have done a good job so far in proving the clinical value of implantable cardiac component pressure monitoring in the outpatient setting. And we see ourselves as targeting a different part of the workflow. I think there are even scenarios where Acorai might be able to identify patients that are particularly well suited for these implantable sensors. The simple fact of the matter is that we really like the inpatient workflow, because we think the incentives are aligned there to really make a difference. Patients benefit, healthcare professionals benefit, hospitals benefit, and payers, in this case mostly CMS, right, benefit from an overall cost of care. So it's one of those, I think, unique parts of the U.S. healthcare system that seems to work quite well, where the incentives are aligned for companies like us to come in and try and solve some things.
What is the realistic addressable market for non-invasive hemodynamic monitoring?
Yeah, so we've, there are over 60 million patients who have heart failure in the world. Some estimates are as high as 250 million. So you can pretty quickly get into some pretty ridiculous numbers if you want to. Yeah. If we just look at the point of care market, which is where we're starting off, in the US, for us, that's a 1.1 billion per year market, just looking at this in-clinic workflow that we talked about today. Globally, we think that's well above 3 billion per year. If you go into the outpatient setting, and if you include other parts of the hospital, the global TAM for heart failure management is just really, really large, right? The annual costs of heart failure currently are over 110 billion per year, and the vast majority of those costs are avoidable, right? So in sort of value-based care type of scenarios, there is tremendous value to be created from reducing the cost of these patients, and we believe the market reflects that as well.
I ask a majority of the founders the same question, and it's always interesting to see the logic behind it. But why do you think major cardiovascular strategics haven't solved this problem already with such a big TAM?
Yeah, it's a good question, and something we spend a lot of time thinking about. I think heart failure is difficult because there are so many comorbidities, and heart failure, ironically, is a little bit of a nascent space in that we haven't really had that many treatment options for these patients from a drug perspective. until quite recently, right? And the drugs work quite well. So heart failure is in many ways dominated by pharma, which I think means that your traditional medtech players have a hard time investing into the space. I think we're becoming a lot more structured about thinking about heart failure as well, which is helping medtech players wanting to get into the space a little bit more. Because I do think that most medtech companies today have a heart failure strategy, or at least have one in development. The last thing I would say is heart failure is managed by a lot of different players depending on what part of the hospital you're in and what type of hospital system you're in, right? So you have the traditional heart failure players, the Abbotts of the world. You have the critical care players, sort of Stryker, BD, and you have the hospital monitoring telemetry players. These guys all compete for space for heart failure patients, a different part of the workflow. Some are naturally more comfortable with patient management, and some are more naturally comfortable with more expensive one device per patient type of settings. There are things definitely moving in this space, and I think we're going to see a lot more large medtech players become more comfortable with that sort of patient management journey.
And when I've introduced the business, obviously I've mentioned hemodynamic intelligence platform. Can you tell us a little bit more about your broader patents family and plans?
Yeah. So what we've developed is a very sophisticated, non-invasive multimodal sensor platform. And with machine learning, the more data you get, the better your machine learning models tend to get, right? So the way we see our device is as something that's going to grow in sophistication and grow in performance over the years as we collect more and more data. We purposely almost over-engineer the device to collect data with the highest quality and with the highest signal fidelity, precisely to prepare us for the future. If you look at the literature of what we could theoretically do, the sort of shopping list is pretty large. Heart failure is the first stop, but we know that we can look at other cardiovascular diseases such as coronary artery disease and valvular heart disease and heart arrhythmias. We know that we can look at pulmonary diseases such as COPD and things like that as well. I think for us, it's just about nailing the business model first and then figuring out how to expand beyond that. But there is of course a scenario in the future where Acorai is sort of the app store of machine learning algorithms that can be added onto the device depending on what your specific needs are as a healthcare professional or hospital and the types of patients that you want to look at.
Thank you. You have an FDA Breakthrough Device Designation, and also you're in the TAP pilot program, which is fairly new, and I'm not sure how many people know about it. How does those two actually help you accelerate your pathways?
Yeah, so we were one of the first companies to join the TAP pilot, which is, to your point, a part of the Breakthrough Device Designation. And the TAP pilot we're big fans of the FDA, and it's been a really great experience in the sense that we've been able to have bi-weekly conversations with the FDA on not just regulatory topics, but reimbursement topics, health economic topics, basically anything that is adjacent to developing a device from a regulatory and clinical perspective. We've been able to submit written amendments, which are sort of mini Q subs on many regulatory topics, and that has allowed us to get a clarity on perhaps the things that are a little bit more boring, but how we should conduct our verification and validation tests for our device, for example. Which, when you're developing something that's completely new, is a little bit harder to wrap your head around, right? Because you want to strike a balance of giving the FDA what they want, but at the same time having something that's least burdensome, right? So they've been very helpful in sort of helping us navigate.
Amazing. And you've already mentioned, obviously, the CaptureHF study, 1,600 patients. You're preparing for another study now. How are you sequencing the clinical studies to optimize regulatory clarity while also preserving capital and continuing the development of the business?
Yeah, no, this is the big question of any startup, right? I think how do you best allocate resources with the limited time and capital that you have?
Yeah.
You just got to talk to your customers, or in the case for a medical device that's not approved yet, right? Who you think your customer is going to be, and ask them what they're going to want to see, right? So we typically look at sort of next year when we're hitting the market, where do we need to be from an evidence generation perspective to help drive adoption, and then we work backwards from there. And I think in general there is excitement about our device. I think we have champions around the world that are willing to adopt our device. So it is our job to give them the story package that they can sell to whoever needs to be part of that decision of adopting a product, right? Part of that is demonstrating that our device is accurate. We've done that. The second part is demonstrating that there is health economic value and benefit for patients, hospitals, and payers. That's what we're starting again today. And the third thing is having early adopters and pilots from the KOLs of the space who can show how this device can be most efficiently implemented. And those are the three things that we're working on. Really trying to get as much done as possible before we get to the market next year.
And you're in the middle of pre-Series A at the moment. From your experience and conversations with investors already, does today's investor environment reward large data sets like your CaptureHF, or are they waiting for the economic proof before they commit?
I think investors have become a lot more picky about what they invest in. So I think having a large data set such as Acorai is obviously very helpful. I think that helps differentiate a lot compared to the other things that are out there today. But in order to believe in a new market, I think you do need to see health economic evidence, and that's part of what we're building with the HOSP-HF study now, which will be another 1,000-patient study run across three continents, so Singapore, Taiwan, Denmark, Sweden, and the US. We'll be joining the study.
And you've mentioned Singapore. That's a new paid pilot that you have secured recently, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah. So we're part of the Chisel program, Center for Health Tech Innovation in Singapore, and they have an annual competition that rewards companies that are serving a large unmet need in the Singaporean healthcare market, the ability to do health economic studies and commercial pilots with 3 of their largest healthcare systems. The privilege of joining 2 of these healthcare systems. So we were the only company in the world awarded 2 pilots with NHG and National Heart Center of Singapore at SingHealth. Yeah, those will be part of this global HOSP-HF study. And we're also actually running a second study there, looking at the emergency care setting and seeing the potential for Acorai to help triage patients faster and more accurately and reduce that door-to-decision time for heart failure patients.
Thank you. And I mean, it's an obvious question, but are you building toward acquisition by a cardiovascular strategic or toward an independent diagnostic platform?
So, yeah, this is something we think about a lot. I think the challenge, as I alluded to earlier, in heart failure is that you have many different players that dominate different parts of the heart failure patient journey. So in the ideal world, you will find a commercialization partner that has the call points that you're looking for, and they can just slot your device in easily. That's it, right? Life isn't that simple, right? And that's part of what we're trying to figure out is, do we raise a larger commercial round or multiple commercial rounds to build sales out ourselves, or do we look at partnering strategically with these 3 different categories that I talked to about earlier: critical care, hospital monitoring, and sort of the heart failure adjacent players. So that's still kind of in development, but I think there is enough interest out there from early adopters to drive some really meaningful revenue. So there is always that option, but you got to think about the long-term game, right, of not just expanding to smaller hospitals in the US and more hospitals in the US, but also to the rest of the world, and who the right commercialization partner might be there.
Maybe as a closing question, fast forwarding 3 or 5 years from now, when Acorai succeeds, what does heart failure management look like?
So I think we will be able to, with our device, show that with some more structured and more sophisticated devices and more structured workflow optimization, you can accomplish some pretty amazing things with these patients. Starting in the in-hospital setting and in the inpatient management of these patients is going to be the I think visual proof point that people are going to need to see that, all right, it's possible here. Now let's roll this out across the entire heart failure ecosystem. And the beauty of the inpatient setting, right, is that workflow is pretty similar across the world, right? So this, I think, demonstrating value in the US for the inpatient setting allows us to scale not just in the US, but really globally, using that as a proof point and the operational protocols needed to drive success.
Well, I can only wish you all of the success possible, and I'll definitely follow your story going forward as well. So, Filip, thank you so much for spending the time with me today.
Thank you, Dame.
Bye.